Leave them. They will not I love it.
Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Now Manchester is the victim of terrorism. On the back of Donald Trump's visit to Saudi Arabia, isn't it time to start the vital conversation on terrorism and the West's involvement in the Middle East? Cross-talking how to confront terrorism, I'm joined by my guests Joshua Landis and Norman. He is the director of the Center of Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma. In San Antonio, we have Brian McClinchy. He is the founder and editor of 28pagers.org. And in London, we cross to Sami Ramadani. He is a contributor on Iraq and the Middle East for The Guardian, as well as a senior lecturer in sociology. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want. Joshua, if I can go to you first, and Norman, you know, we have this very short timeline here. We had the President of the United States in Riyadh signing a very, what maybe become an infamous arms deal of about $350 million over the course of 10 years, setting up a center to fight extreme ideology, which was very difficult for me to watch for obvious reasons. And then we have another attack, a terrorist attack in Europe, this time in Manchester. I can't even remember all the cities now. It's so many. It's really time for the political establishment to start talking about the connection between the two. I don't have any solid evidence about the motivations of the people that did this in Manchester, so I'm going to hold my tongue on that. But I think it is fair enough to say that when we have a regime like Saudi Arabia that is exporting a very extreme ideology and saying it's going to be the center to look after all this, I think we need to have a conversation about that. Go ahead, Joshua.
Well, we do, and pumping in more arms, as we saw, which has become the policy of the United States, to sell arms to all the different powers, is really a tinderbox. It's throwing sparks on the meltdown of the Middle East. What the Middle East needs is hundreds of thousands of new jobs that will provide a future for all of this youth bulge that has been at the heart of the Arab Spring uprisings and the collapse of Middle Eastern states. Arms is clearly not the answer. It's going to create much more misery. It's going to be used ultimately to kill Arabs in the different Middle Eastern states. So it's not a promising policy. It is the policy that the United States has pursued now for decades.
Brian, if I can go to you, it's not a promising policy. I think that's a real understatement here. I mean, Joshua's absolutely right. I mean, it's just doubling down on a failed approach to the Middle East for decades now. And again, you know, Saudi Arabia is plummeting one of the poorest countries in the world. Now it's America's war. And it was very open about that in Riyadh on the part of the United States. And it creates also more tension. We could talk about maybe in another program, but, you know, this is inflaming sectarianism. It was very anti-Iran, talking about an Arab NATO. I mean, Joshua is right. Where are the jobs in all of this? Go ahead, Brian.
Oh, yeah, some of those jobs are in congressional districts all across the country, which is why arms deals like these are so popular in Capitol Hill. However, you know, it is right that it is doubling down on a failed policy. You know, one thing that's been surprisingly sparse in a lot of coverage I've seen of this weapons deal is the word Yemen, and the fact that so many of these weapons will be directed into that terrible, unjust war that's being inflicted upon that country with the full assistance of the United States, to include the participation of the United States Air Force in refueling Saudi jets that are going there and attacking way too many civilian targets. And really, that entire policy of supporting that war in Yemen is one of the most perilous policies the United States government is sponsoring right now in terms of motivating future acts of terrorism, in all likelihood, against United States citizens.
You know, Sammy, weigh in there, because, you know, there's this this relationship that the West has with Saudi Arabia. You know, in the country right next door, Iran, they had a democratic election. That's never happened in Saudi Arabia. But the West embraces a country that has nothing to do with American or British or European values. Far from it. Go ahead, Sammy.
Well, as President Trump put it during his election campaign, all they have is money and we're going to take their money.
Yeah.
In fact, he even said it twice. He said that these Gulf states won't exist without us. They won't exist. He repeated it. And I think he was telling the truth there, in the sense that the Saudi regime, amongst other Gulf regimes, are so heavily dependent for their existence and power on United States support, whether it's military, intelligence, other forms of support. They have the money, they have the oil, and this is what the United States is interested in. And the relationship with the Saudi royal family and the United States dates back many decades. We're talking post-World War II encouragement of the Saudi royal family to take an active part in the Arab world and Islamic world. In fact, it was President Eisenhower who told King Saud, the previous king of Saudi Arabia, to lead a world Islamic organization. Even this role of leading the so-called Islamic world by the Saudi royal family was generated in Washington.
Yeah,
mainly the Saudi royal family.
Sammy, let me ask you a question here. I mean, the ideology of the Saudi royal family is Wahhabism. That is not necessarily what is practiced around the world. As much as they would like it to be, that form of Islam is very specific to them, okay? And this is, again, one of the big problems here, and that brings in the element of terrorism as well. Because the United States doesn't have a relationship with Saudi Arabia. It has a relationship with the Saudi royal family, okay? Okay.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you mentioned Wahhabism. I was going to come to that, because Wahhabism is not even recognized in the general broad Islamic world as one of the four Sunni schools of thought. There are four different types of Sunnism, if you like, within Sunni Islam, and obviously there is Shia Islam, and these are the recognized schools of thought within Islam in general. And Wahhabism, even at a recent conference of all leading Islamic scholars, they refuse to recognize Wahhabism as a branch of Islam. It's a cult, and an extremist cult that preaches violence, that has sponsored terrorism across the Arab and Islamic world.
You know, Joshua, the United States, it looks very obvious that it's chosen the Sunni side of this divide when sectarianism isn't because there is sectarianism, the United States is actually fueling it on. And again, if you look what happened in Riyadh, it was obviously just an anti-Iranian agenda. I mean, it was very clear to me, at least. Go ahead, Joshua.
Well, you're absolutely right. And this did seem to be a reversion to a previous American stand, which is to undo what President Obama had tried to do a little bit, which was to make a small move towards balancing Iran and Saudi Arabia, hence the nuclear deal with Iran. But, you know, ultimately, the United States is talking a big Sunni game and trying to rekindle ties to its traditional allies, the Gulf countries, Israel, and making up with Turkey a little bit. But if you look underneath the apparent policy of pro-Sunni, anti-Iran, our military policy on the ground in Iraq and Syria is very pro-Shiite, pro-Iran. We are arming Shiites in Iraq to kill Sunni extremists. And this is helping Iran. Now, this has infuriated Saudi Arabia and Turkey, but in a sense, what this trip is doing is creating the apparent reconsolidation of our Sunni alliance. But at the same time, we're undermining it by helping Iran militarily on the ground in Iraq. And in a sense, we have allowed Russia to do something very similar to what we're doing in Iraq, which is to help a pro-Iranian, pro-Shiite regime, the Assad regime, reconsolidate power. Why? Because we're frightened of ISIS, we're frightened of al-Qaeda, we're frightened of Islamic extremism. Shiism, in a sense, to destroy Sunni extremism, in the same way that the United States is exploiting pro-Iranian groups to destroy Sunni extremism in Iraq. And that has got the Sunni world upside down. So by selling all these arms to the Sunnis, we're trying to mollify that anger.
You know, Brian, considering... hang on, we get Brian in there because we haven't heard much from him.
Okay.
Brian, let's go to the 28 pages in the 9/11 report. Remember what Donald Trump had to say about that during the campaign? And then his words of praise in Riyadh. How do you square the circle? Or you can't? Go ahead, Brian.
You can't. You can't. 1 year ago, we had Donald Trump alluding to the 28 then classified pages from the 9/11 congressional inquiry that point to many, many links between Saudi government officials, the Saudi royal family, the 9/11 hijackers, and those who supported them. Fast forward a year after those 28 pages are declassified largely, and we can see so many of those details now, and you see the image of Trump dancing with swords with the royal family. And 9/11, some people say, oh, well, that was way back in 2001. We have to remember one thing. When he was in the presence of King Salman, when he was Prince Salman, led the Saudi High Commission for the Relief of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which has been deeply implicated in supporting the al-Qaeda, the 9/11 hijackers, funding the camps in Afghanistan and the safe havens over there that were used to organize and orchestrate those attacks. And even more recently, we had the leaked memo from Hillary Clinton, where she was acknowledging, perhaps written by Podesta, but under her pen, was acknowledging the fact that Saudi Arabia continues to be a principal supporter of terrorism and extremism in the Middle East and around the world. So you've got this towering hypocrisy.
All right, let me jump in here, gentlemen.
At the same time, you've got
I have to go to a hard break, and after our short break, we'll continue the discussion on how to fight terrorism. Stay with RT. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lindell. To remind you, we're discussing how to fight terrorism. Okay, let's go back to Sammy in London. Every time you're on this program, we talk about Saudi Arabia. I feel like you're going to bust through the screen. Go ahead, Sammy.
Yeah, well, mainly really, Peter, because the Saudi royal family has a lot to answer for. And some other Gulf rulers, whether it was the war on Iraq, the war in Syria, the war on Libya. The Saudi royal family has been the linchpin of U.S. policy, along with Israel, of course, in the Middle East. And I took exception to something that Joshua said, describing Iraq as a Shia state. I think that is really, with all due respect, is nonsense. There is sectarianism in this regime. There are the sectarians who claim to represent the Shia, sectarians who claim to represent Sunnis, Kurds, etc. They're sharing in the loot of power in a way, and it is neither a Shia or a Sunni state. I think these kind of sectarian divisions was certainly encouraged by the United States after the occupation of Iraq in 2003. And he's saying that they are arming the Shia to fight the Sunnis. Sorry, they are arming various sectarian groups, whether it is they are Sunni sectarian or Shia sectarian, and they are encouraging this across the Arab and Islamic world. And look at Syria. The United States and its allies, Saudi, Qatar, and even Israel, have been backing al-Nusra Front in Syria, a branch of al-Qaeda. Earlier on, they had links with ISIS itself, the Saudi royal family. So we need to look at U.S. policy from the point of view of milking Saudi Arabia for its oil, milking the Middle East for its oil, and also backing Israel as a strategic military, political, economic base for the United States.
Yes, in mainstream media, they don't like to talk about the strong connection between Israel and Saudi Arabia and their joint objectives in the region, which is, well, it gets to the point of fake news on their part. Joshua, let's talk about Syria, because in the conclave in Riyadh, they were talking about getting together 34,000 troops from whoever wants to participate from the countries, the 55 countries that participated in the meeting there. I mean, what did you take away from that? Because they don't need more troops. They need de-escalation. That's what Syria needs right now. Do you have any takeaway from that? Or is it just some kind of pledge that everyone wants to get on board and everybody forgets later and expects the U.S. and other Western countries to do all the heavy work there? Go ahead.
Well, I think that the U.S. plan is now pretty well understood, which is to help the Syrian Democratic Forces, that's the name that the United States has given to them. Essentially, they are the Kurdish forces of northern Syria with some Arab fighters to take on ISIS and take it in Raqqa, and then theoretically to move down the Euphrates. That's the difficult part. This alliance with Kurdish nationalism, in a sense, the United States firing up Kurdish forces whose ambition is to create Rojava in northern Syria, helps the United States because the U.S. is constrained. It wants to destroy ISIS, but it refuses to put many soldiers on the ground. Therefore, you need a proxy army, and the Kurds have volunteered to do this,
but Josh,
hoping that they will get arms in a state.
Towards what end? Nobody. All of the states in that region want a Kurdish state. Nobody wants it, okay, including a NATO ally. I mean, that seems like to me a very short-term aim to achieve something that no one is going to accept. I mean,
it is a short-term aim.
Because when the Kurds move into other places, they're seen as occupiers as well, okay, not just al-Nusra and ISIS. I mean, they're considered occupiers. So I don't see that that's a well-thought-out plan. But then again, nothing is well thought out when it comes to Syria and when it coming out of the West. Let me go to Brian here. Brian, in your sense in looking at this issue, the 28 pages and whatnot, how do you see coverage of Saudi Arabia in American media for American viewers to understand the kind of relationship Washington has with Riyadh? Go ahead.
I don't think the typical American citizen has any kind of a solid sense of that relationship and what it really means and what it's really about. For example, Yemen is terribly underreported.
Right.
It's not, beyond the casualties, you've got this famine that's underway and now a cholera outbreak as this blockade continues on that country, which will only encourage additional extremism. But this relationship between the Saudi government and the U.S. government, they're called an ally. In some ways, I think it's more of a relationship of accomplices. This idea that they're united now as against terrorism, when unfortunately the fact is both these countries have used the fomentation of extremism as a policy weapon. Yeah. To pursue regime change, tracing all the way back to Afghanistan. And so in many ways we see it, with this subtle help of the al-Nusra Front, an al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, and the fact that the rebel forces, so-called rebel forces, are deeply permeated with Islamic jihadists who hold close to that Wahhabist doctrine. And so you really have to question the sincerity of the U.S. government in actually wanting to quell terrorism. It seems more often that they're wanting to channel it to whatever goal they have at that moment.
Well, Sammy, again, when I looked at the communique and those dreadful pictures of the sword dancing and all of that, I find it, I'm sorry, I'll say it bluntly, I find it laughable that the United States wants to work with Saudi Arabia to fight terrorism. I mean, I think that is absolutely absurd, okay, considering the long history we've seen here. But really the message was about Iran, and this is what it was directed to. I mean, all of that, all those weapons that are going to be sold over the last 10 years, $350 billion. Yeah, a lot will be used to fight Yemen. But I think they're also, if you saw that big control room with the orb and all that, I think everything is about Iran right there. They're not looking about what their surrogates are doing in Syria. I can't believe that whatsoever. Go ahead, Sammy.
I think you're right to point at the question of Iran, because this has been one of the cornerstones of U.S. policy in the Middle East since the 1979 revolution in Iran, or since Iran became really an independent state. However much you want to, whichever way you want to look at Iran, the fact is that it broke its links with the United States in 1979, and the United States has been trying to undermine that independent status ever since. And Trump seemed to be taking this to another extreme. George Bush tried to even launch a war on Iran after they invaded Iraq, but the Iraq invasion itself got bogged down, and the war on Iran was put on hold. It seems Trump is on the verge of encouraging that process yet again, to try to build an alliance, an open alliance between the Gulf states led by Saudi Arabia and Israel, because Israel is determined to make Iran the big enemy, and they're trying to convince as many so-called Muslim leaders or Arab leaders to be part of this so-called Arab NATO, to isolate Iran and to attack it completely unjustifiably by pointing at Iranian intervention in Yemen without a shred of evidence. Yemen is one of the poorest countries, its people being massacred and blockaded, no medicine. This is a sick joke to say that Saudi Arabia can become the center of fighting terrorism, when at least on the ideological front it's the fountain of the ideological fountain of terrorism for the entire Islamic world. And in fact, even the Vice President of the United States said that Saudi Arabia was funding and arming Al-Qaeda in Syria. This is all on the record. For Trump today to try and portray Saudi Arabia as a center for fighting terrorism is a sick joke.
You know, Joshua,
and one of the most preposterous...
Go ahead, Brian, jump in. Go right ahead.
You bet. One of the most preposterous moments in Trump's address was, as it rhetorically flowed, it really flowed to that conclusion of vilifying Iran at the end. That was really kind of the crescendo of his address. And he got to that point where he said, no war against terrorism will be complete, unless you address those who give it financing and safe harbor and so forth, which to any rational observer of the facts, that description would apply to Saudi Arabia, but instead he tried to apply it to Iran. And I think the great majority of the world, when they think of terrorism, they think of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. But they would get the impression from that speech that Iran was supporting those Sunni extremist groups that think the Iranian government is completely illegitimate, and its faith is illegitimate as well.
Joshua,
if I can
go ahead, jump in, please do.
I think the only way to the way to understand this is that the United States is joined at the hip with Saudi Arabia. Oil makes the world go around, and oil helps make the United States the dominant international power. We saw that after World War II that Hitler was defeated in large part because the West dominated oil. El Alamein and Stalingrad were about denying Hitler access to oil. And ever since then, the United States has understood that if it can dominate the supply of oil in the world, that means the Persian Gulf, where 50% of the world's oil is in reserves under the Persian Gulf. The United States can have its hand on the spigot, and it cannot give that up. Iran threw us out in '79. We thought we could rehabilitate Iraq. We've failed. Saudi Arabia has become our aircraft carrier on the Persian Gulf. We are wedded to it, and we have to make the most out of it. I think that's what Americans argue amongst themselves, and that therefore this visit to Saudi Arabia, saying that we're fighting the common fight against terrorism, is about justifying that situation.
Okay, well, oil and terrorism, what a terrible mixture. We're out of time, gentlemen. Many thanks to my guests in San Antonio, Norman, and in London. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules.
I love Thank you.